We are really excited for tonight's Food for Thought speaker. His name is Adam Wieser, and he is a grocery lead at the Common Market. He has worked with us for the past the past 8 years. He's been living in Frederick for the past 10 years. He is a member of the deaf community. Before COVID, he is also a serious foodie. So he's traveled extensively just for the food, not for sightseeing. And he's eaten at several Michelin star restaurants in the US and Europe. And also at home, post-COVID, he said his appetite is being sated by being a dad to a delicious 5-month-old girl. So Adam Wieser, we're really happy to have you here tonight. And we also have an interpreter with us. His name is Ted Barron. He works with the Frederick Interpreting Agency. So thank you to Adam, and thank you to Ted.
I'm unmuted now. Okay. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. I will be voicing. I am off, but I will be voicing for Adam.
Go ahead, whenever you're ready.
All right. I'm very happy to be here. I want to thank Libby and Megan for setting this up. I'm a little bit nervous, so I wanted to open up with a little joke, if that's all right. You know, when there's a hitchhiker on the road and they're walking down the road, and then if a car pulls over and the hitchhiker gets in, the driver will, the driver says, "Hey, I'm deaf." And the hitchhiker says, "Hey, no problem. That's cool." And then they're driving down the road, the cop pulls them over. And the cop comes up to the driver's side, and says in his voice, and says, "License and registration, please." And the deaf driver says, "Hey, I'm deaf. I can't hear." And the cop says, "Oh man, okay, that's fine." And then in a gesture says, "Slow down and let him go." And they're, you know, so and that does happen, and that's happened to me, and it can happen. And so, and the hitchhiker was like, "Hey, wow, that was cool. He got away with that. I'll keep that in mind." So as they're going down the road, the driver got tired and asked the hitchhiker, "Hey, you mind switching? Maybe you can drive." So the hitchhiker gets into the car, gets into the driver's seat and starts driving down the road. And once again, they get pulled over, and the hitchhiker remembers, hey, what the deaf driver did, and says, "Hey, so the cop comes up to the driver's side and says, "Hey, your license registration, please." And the hitchhiker says, I can't hear," kind of gestures and can't hear. And the cat says, "That's all right. I know sign language. Your license and registration, please." So I was born to hearing parents. I was born hearing in Ohio, in a very rural area near Dayton, outside of Dayton. At 7 months old, I got sick with spinal meningitis. And unfortunately, the infection caused some damage to my cochlea, so I am profoundly deaf in both ears. My parents had no idea at the time I was deaf, and they didn't even know until I was about 1, when my grandfather had actually kind of said, "There's something not right here." So he got the old pots and pans and started banging them behind me, and I did not even flinch. So we went to the doctor and confirmed that I was completely and profoundly deaf. To my parents' credit, they heard about, you know, classes that were offering sign language. So and they started immediately taking sign language classes. And those sign language classes were more focused on signed English, which is very different than ASL. It's intended to use sign language with proper grammar, while ASL is very different. They have their own grammar and syntax. So I learned C-sign and some oral methods too as well. And I was so profoundly deaf I have no idea what I was sounding like. My only my parents can understand me when I was on. And we learned some home signs. So it was like gesturals and made up signs, just so that we can have the most basic communication in the house. So I knew very little, very few deaf people around, and maybe every now and then I would bump into a deaf person once or twice a year. So I never really knew any other one that was deaf. And it was a strange time growing up, because oddly enough, my mother was a piano teacher and she wanted the best for me. So she thought one of the best things to do is maybe I could be the next Beethoven and learn how to use the piano. So there was no way I could learn. And so when I got into school, they put me in music class as well. So then I learned how to remember the recorder. So I had to learn how to play the recorder. So I tried my very best to fit in, by doing what my mom wanted me to do, by making the teachers happy. And but I knew my limits, and so that wasn't very much help, of course. So with that, it did make me feel of a lesser of a person, lesser of myself. I didn't have an identity. I was trying so hard to fit into the hearing world. And I thought my way of life was to make people accept me by being who they wanted me to be. And also at being the only deaf person in the entire school until I was 12 years old. I had friends, of course, but never really could talk to them, have full conversations, couldn't express myself, full thoughts, express full thoughts with them. And at one point, my interpreter, who was a great help in my life and a great help at school one-on-one through those years, and looked at me eventually and said, I think you need to go to a deaf school. And just, what do you mean I got deaf school? There's a deaf school? I had no idea that there was such a thing. So I told my parents. My parents were sort of disappointed, and it was so far away. There was the closest one was 3 hours away, and I had to go and stay there for the week, and then I'd be home for the weekend only. But they were so willing to do that for the best of me. So I went to the Indiana School for the Deaf, and now I just want to go back and give you a little history of ASL and deafness. There's not much evidence of the history of deaf people in America before the 1820s. At that point, there's a large population of deaf people in Martha's Vineyard, which is off the coast of Massachusetts, in the 1700s through the 1800s. And they actually had 1 out of 25 people on the island that were deaf. So to compare with 1 out of 40 people that even just use ASL. So Martha's Vineyard had their own sign language, but it was very closed in, very isolated to the island, of course. All the other deaf people in America had their own home signs, were spread out, no official education system until 1812, when a preacher named Thomas Gallaudet, he noticed, he was recovering from an illness, and he was in his parents' home in Connecticut and had noticed a young girl named Alice Cogswell, and she was playing outside. She was separate from the other kids, and he had noticed that, and he tried to find out what was wrong with her. Found out that she was deaf, and met her dad, who was a doctor, and so the both of them can tell that she was very intelligent, but the teacher, how to read, how to write, was a struggle because of the communication. So there was a group of men that financed the best way to learn. So they sent a group of people to Braidwood School in England, which they supported the oral method. But unfortunately, it didn't seem to be the best, and they weren't willing to share that method with Gallaudet. So, and the money started to run out. So finally they met somebody. I was working at a deaf school in Paris, France. And so they went to Paris, France, and met two teachers, one of them whom was deaf, and his name was Laurent Claire. And so when he was willing to come back to America with Thomas Gallaudet and start the first deaf school, which was in Hartford, Connecticut, the American School for the Deaf, and that was 1817. So many of those students from Martha's Vineyard went there, and then they started learning languages, and they were bringing their home signs with them. And so they had a conglomerate of different sign language, and then you had French Sign Language. So it was all a mixture of languages. And then it became the foundation of ASL. And this is why and this is what I wanted to add is, when I talk to British people, we don't understand British people at all. If I meet a French deaf person, we can speak, and we can speak well. It's very interesting. So a lot of their students through the 1820s were leaving the schools there and creating their own schools. So my school, the Indiana School for the Deaf, was set up in 1843 by a graduate of there, William Willard, who was a former graduate at the American School for the Deaf. So ASL itself started to kind of spread out throughout the nation, including the Maryland School for the Deaf, which is right around the corner from here, that started in 1868. With that, ASL started to become intricate part of deaf education, and also they eventually set up Gallaudet University in DC. So now with that, I went to the Indiana School for the Deaf when I was 13, and came in. And coming from where I came from, where you only see a few people a year, deaf people a year, to a place where everyone knows ASL, everybody, and I can now talk to anybody. I walk by a person in the hallway, I could talk to this person, and it was absolutely amazing. Incredible experience for me, but I had noticed that I didn't know ASL. So now I had to learn again and try to fit in again. So learning ASL and motivating myself to learn ASL at the Indiana School for the Deaf. And also, it's a very small school. So playing three sports, most of the boys had to play 3 sports, but it was great. So it gave us opportunity to travel and meet other people at other deaf schools in Texas, Tennessee, Maryland. We came here to Maryland, and Maryland always destroyed us in every sport. But that's where I met my future wife 22 years ago. So she was a cheerleader here at the Maryland School for Deaf. I was a football player at the Indians. So we dated for a short while at the time. So that was a wonderful opportunity to be a part of sports, socialization, meeting deaf people all around the U.S. I had a prom date who was from Chicago that was able to come to a prom with me, and I met a girl, and I went to space camp in Alabama. I was invited there, and I'll mention that. I'll talk about that a little bit later. But for the space camp was one of the opportunities that the Indiana School for the Deaf allowed me to learn, and that led to a great project that's always been very special to me. They asked NASA asked 6 students to come to Florida to do an underwater lab experiment, so that they could see how people can communicate in an environment where you can't speak, like underwater, for example. So I had to learn how to scuba dive. So I got my scuba license, went to Florida, and so we were 60 feet underwater, and we were doing this building exercise, and the deaf students were able to communicate, working together easily underwater. with ASL easily. And it was fun. It was a great experience. But at the moment, one guy had this huge camera and he was coming down and he was trying to film us. And he was in our way. And we told him, hey, excuse me, get away from here, because we couldn't see each other. So the interpreter swam over to us. He goes, hey, explain to us that, hey, that person that holding the camera there was James Cameron, whose movie he made a movie that just came out called Titanic. And so at the time I was like, and so he asked us, and he actually invited us to his underwater apartment. Apparently he was training for deep sea diving, and one of the requirements was to have to stay underwater for 24 hours. So that's when we just so happened to be there. So we swam underwater and into this tunnel and up into his apartment. And there we were with the director with no shirt on. Hey, welcome. Hey, thanks for coming. All I want to do is talk about, all I wanted to do was talk about all his movies, what he did. But my classmates kept on bothering him saying, hey, why don't you have deaf people in your movies? Where's our representation? And at the moment I thought, wow, it hit me that growing up, I didn't have an identity. I thought, it was a disability. I felt lesser, but here were my classmates fighting for our recognition. And it was a proud moment for us. It was a proud moment for being deaf. And it was really special to me. It was a turning moment that I was more than, that we deserve more. So moving on to the Maryland School for the Deaf, my wife and I, we do bicker about which is the best school, the Maryland School for the Deaf or the Indiana School for the Deaf, ongoing thing. So I left the Indiana School for the Deaf and I went back out into the real world. And unfortunately, reality comes back. And so I don't see as many deaf people. I can't talk to as many people. I can't talk to anybody that I choose to talk to. And it was tough. And I lived in Kansas for about 10 years. And then I finally reconnected with my wife, and who happened to live here in Frederick, Maryland. So I decided to move to Frederick, Maryland. And I started working here at Common Market. And I was shocked to see how many deaf people live here in Frederick. And here at Common Market, I have bumped into more hearing people that know sign language than deaf people themselves. And so it tells me what kind of community we live in here in Frederick. And actually, I bumped into my prom date from Chicago, here in Chicago, and she was shopping here in Common Market. Her kids actually happened to go to the Maryland School for the Deaf. One of the girls in the space camp is a wife of one of my coworkers at Common Market. So that's how small the world is in the deaf community. And that's the reason why I'm here. There's the best schools here, the Maryland School, and they provide some of the best opportunities. So I guess I have to say that Maryland School for the Deaf is the best school in America, but I will never admit that to her. And I really wanted to be involved, and I feel like time's running out, but we live in a unique place where I finally get the sense and the feeling of what I have at the deaf school, and I feel like that's back. And I'm comfortable here talking, and most people here, most of you know how to say, almost everybody knows how to say thank you in ASL, and that's pretty simple, but that's, so I'm very humbled, and I'm also very proud to live here in Frederick, and especially to work at Common Market, where I see my old friends around, where I meet new deaf people. So my identity is a capital D deaf person. I'm proud to be deaf. I don't think there's anything wrong with me anymore. So, but I do have one complaint about Frederick, is that the first time I did get pulled over, I tried to explain to the cop I'm deaf, and he said, "Oh, that's all right. I know ASL. So where's your license and registration, please?" So I hope you enjoyed that.
That was fantastic.
Thank you so much, Adam.
Oh, they're clapping too.
Thank you, Adam.